Hello everyone, and welcome to the next instalment in the International Association of Genocide Scholars book launch webinars. I'm Melanie O'Brien. I'm the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and it's a pleasure to see you all here. And I would like to introduce our two speakers for you tonight. So our discussant this evening is Mirjana Gavrilović-Nilsson, who's a PhD candidate and atrocity criminologist currently doing a PhD in law at the Edinburgh Law School at the University of Edinburgh. Mirjana completed a BA with honours in criminology at the University of Manchester in 2017, followed by a Master of Science with distinction in investigative psychology at the University of Huddersfield in 2018. After that, in 2019, she undertook an internship in the Investigative Analysis Division in the Prosecution Division at the International Criminal Court. And after that, she decided to begin her PhD at the University of Edinburgh as an atrocity criminologist. Mirjana also volunteers with His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons for Scotland as an independent prison monitor. So Mirjana will be in discussion tonight with our author, Dr. Hikmet Karčić, who is a genocide and Holocaust scholar based in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And he has a PhD from the International University of Sarajevo. Hikmet was the 2017 Auschwitz Institute Keene State College Global Fellow, and he has written extensively on genocide denial and atrocity prevention. He is a sought-after commentator on international media outlets, with his articles covering far-right extremism and mass atrocities that have appeared in news outlets such as Haaretz, Newsweek, and Foreign Policy. But today, he's here to discuss his recently published book, which is published by University of Michigan Press, Torture, Humiliate, Kill, Inside the Bosnian Camp System. Thank you, Mirjana and Hikmet. I turn it over to you now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for that really nice introduction. I just want to say that I'm really happy to be here today, and thank you to you, the IAGS, for inviting me to be a discussant for Hikmet's book today in this the semester's book launch series. And Hikmet, my friend, let me just thank you for your hard work and also in writing this book. I know there was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, but reading the book myself, I've had a lot of my own aha moments, and I've learned a lot. So thank you very, very much. And before we jump into the book, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you came to be in this field, including what motivated you to research the established detention camps during the war in Bosnia.
Thank you, Mirjana. Thanks to Mel and to IAGS for organizing this. Well, first off, my interest in mass atrocities has been around for quite some time. So when I did my master thesis at the University of Sarajevo on missing persons and on family lawsuits against the Bosnian government regarding missing persons. And while I was doing that master thesis, I realized that a large number of Bosnian civilians went missing during the war, mainly from detention centers and concentration camps, and which then led to my interest in whether in the whole issue of concentration camps and detention centers. And that's when I realized that nobody had actually done any comprehensive research on this topic. Most of the books which were written in local languages were mainly focused on either case studies of some towns, or case studies of or a memoir written by a survivor. Mostly it was memoirs, and these camps were merely mentioned throughout the concept of murder, of maybe some sort of it was mainly very much sidelined by the authors. So that's when I decided that researching the whole entire camp system would be very interesting, and the concept of camps in Bosnia, which I found fascinating. And also when I was a young child, I was playing with kids whose parents or fathers rather were from the Krajina area, from Prijedor, and that's actually how I also had some sort of, let's say, personal touch with the family members who survived, and that actually stirred up more interest in this topic. And that's when I realized that there is something much more deeper to research regarding this issue.
Thank you. No, it's really interesting how also you have this personal touch to the reasons why you decided to research this. I think anyone that has some sort of connection to Bosnia and is researching this area of atrocity crimes or mass atrocities that occurred, that we all sort of have some personal motivation as well towards why we decided to delve deeper into this subject. So thank you for that. But before we get into the argument, I know that, well, tell us about the choice of the title of the book, because why did you choose this title rather than simply, for example, simply Inside the Bosnian Serb Camp System? So, I mean, your title is quite striking. So tell us about that.
Well, when I was doing my research on I'll get to that later on these 4 case studies, 4 towns, I basically made a chart on a whiteboard, and I was writing down the similarities and the differences between these camps. And what struck me, and at that time I was in New Hampshire in the US as a fellow at Key State, was these three words kept on popping up throughout my research, and that is torture, humiliate, kill. A murder, or murder, torture, humiliation. It was going on and on and on and on. In the end, when I looked at these 4 case studies, I decided maybe the best thing, to sum up the Bosnian Serb camp system, I would say torture, humiliate, kill. Not extermination, but torture, humiliate, kill. So that's why, and I found it actually very, very, very catchy. And I figured, I will suggest this to the publisher, and if they like it, they'll pick up it, and they loved it. So that's how it stayed, actually.
That's really interesting. And for me, when I first read it and when I first saw the title, the torture, humiliate, kill, it sort of lent this idea to the pattern of violence that spread across Bosnia, and the repetitiveness of it. And it was a pattern. So it sort of resonated with that in my mind. But yeah, it's a very captivating, definitely, and provokes different emotions. So thank you for that. So let's hear more about your methods for researching the detention camps. I'm sure there are a few PhDs like myself here today who this would be really useful to. I know that you use documentary analysis, looking at a wide range of sources, including the ICTY archives. So why did you choose this method compared to, say, interviews? And I also know that you traveled around to a lot of sites as well. So maybe you can comment on that and any challenges in your research methods that you encountered.
Well, firstly, I followed most of the cases which were going on at the ICTY as a law student, and later on it was my interest. And I was also following the local courts in Bosnia, the trials going on there. And I also had some experience working with the Missing Persons Institute in Bosnia regarding mass graves. So in some of these cases, I came in touch with many survivors. And one of the things which I noticed after some time was that like when you compare, and this is one of the key things in the ICTY trials, but also in Boston trials, Boston National Courts, is that the defense would always take the witness statements from, for example, 95, 96, 97 of the witnesses, and then say, and compare it to the latest witness statements which were given to the court of BH or ICTY. And this is how they would try to discredit the witnesses by saying, 20 years ago, you stated that, this and this happened and that this and this person was there, but now you claim that only this person was there and so on. And actually, in most of these cases, you have issues that people, time has passed by, people don't really remember the facts or the exact things which happened 25 years ago, like the color of the van or whether it was a sunny day or not and things like that. And these are small technical issues on which the defense would usually try to discredit the witnesses. So when I was writing my thesis, I wanted to write a book which would be entirely based on well-proven facts, so that some of the facts which are there cannot be discredited. I think it was Sheriff Basuni who once told the local Bosnian prosecutor, you don't need to have 10 rape witnesses. You need to have one credible, one good rape witness to prosecute a perpetrator. So in that case, I decided that, following, and I'm a big fan of Raul Hilberg's work. So, following this concept, I decided to use Serbian documentation. So using the perpetrator documentation in order to show when a camp was established, what happened there, and then using the court verified witness statements and established facts from the judgments. I wanted to prove a point, because I didn't want to write an extensive history of the camps. That was my aim. I just wanted to show what was the pattern, what was the aim, the nature behind the camps themselves. Thus, I didn't go into interviews with survivors, even though I talked to a lot of them. Some of them were also witnesses in the Bosnian National Court, some of them at the ICTY, and so on. But rather, instead of taking, and I'm not really a fan of taking interviews, or doing interviews with witnesses, because it's really re-traumatizing for them again. If they had already given, interviews, witness statements in the courts, I decided just to use that in that sense. So basically, I think the biggest, most positive aspects of writing in this way was that you get accurate facts on, for example, the establishment of the camp. Like, when was Batković camp established in Bijeljina? If you ask a witness, he would say, July, May, April. I mean, a detainee who was brought to a camp doesn't necessarily know when the camp was officially established, and he doesn't even need to know. But when you have an official document from the Eastern Bosnian command post of the Bosnian Serb army, that's a whole different issue. So that's why I focus on this documentation. And luckily, the ICTY had a really large pile of documentation which they used in the courts, and this was accessible. And basically, I had to gather all these documents. I went through thousands of documents just to find, all those who use the ICTY archives know that you can't really just go and search through the document. You have to download each and every one of them. So I had to download each and every one of them, go through them, identify them, pile them up, and then sort them by municipality, and then put it all in a whole context. So I wanted to write something which was comprehensive, but also which would be interesting for a person who's for the first time reading something about Bosnia to get into it very, very, very easily.
And what I can definitely resonate with this, since this is what I'm doing, this sort of research method for my own PhD. But what challenges did you encounter by using the ICT archives or the documents from the BIH court?
Well, firstly, first problem was that the Bosnian courts are not as accessible as the ICTY is, which is kind of funny because living in Sarajevo, it's very difficult to get that document, which is a few kilometers away from me. But rather, I can log in online and get something from The Hague, which was it's still very fascinating for me. Secondly, some of these towns, such as Visegrad, for example, don't have a lot of documentation accessible, because and this, in order to explain this, I need to go back to 1998 when the ICTY was setting up their persecution cases against some high-ranking Bosnian Serb officials from Bosanska Krajina, such as Brđanin and the others. And at that time, the Stabilization Force, S4, they conducted raids in different military objects throughout the country, seizing documentation. So once this was going on in the northwestern part of Bosnia, in towns such as Visegrad, Foča, and so on, this documentation was, according to my knowledge, taken over across the Drina into Serbia and for safekeeping. So documentation from the crisis staff, the Bosnian Serb crisis staff in Visegrad, for example, is virtually non-existent right now. It's not available. It's probably somewhere hidden in Serbia. So we still don't have. I didn't have the possibility to get the whole entire insight in as much as I would have liked. And so, for example, the information we have on the operation of the camp system in Prijedor is much more larger than the one in Bileća or in Visegrad and so on.
Well, thank you, Hikmet. Yeah, like I said, I can definitely sympathize with some of the challenges that you have, because I'm having the same challenges right now. But that was really useful, so thank you. Anyway, to the main argument of your book, and that's collective traumatization. You argue that death was not the main motivation of these camps, as one would think that the camps, for example, during the Holocaust were. And also when you hear the word detention concentration camps, that's sort of what we assume. So can you tell the audience more about what is meant by collective traumatization and its relation to detention camps in that aspect?
Well, when you read these judgments from the ICTY and so on and so forth, like you always is the issue of intent, and whether there was genocide intent or not, and the issue of what does it mean to destroy part of a group. So, for example, in the case of Bosnian and Karčić and so on, it was argued that there was no genocide in Prijedor because the number of people killed in Prijedor, for example, did not constitute a large part of a group. Like 3,500 people out of, let's say 50,000 people, in that sense, does not constitute a large part of the group. But again, knowing what these people went through, speaking with them and so on, I figured that for them, the war did not end, the genocide did not end in 1992 or 1995. They're still living through it. And the whole, actually, whenever you sit down with survivors, with camp survivors, whenever you drink coffee, whatever, whether it's a wedding or a funeral or whatever else, they always talk about the same thing. It's always there, living with it. So that's when I realized actually that this what had happened to them was something which was inflicted on them, and which, I mean, if the local Serbs in Prijedor wanted to kill each and every person in the camp, they could have done it. That's my opinion, because they, in the first couple of months of 1992, there was no media, no foreign media access there. There was no internet. They could have done, and they did actually whatever they wanted in the camps without anybody else from outside of the camp knowing it. So for me, it was always interesting, why weren't these people killed? I mean, why didn't they kill everybody? But then when you see what these people went through on a psychological basis, it's much more worse than the murder itself. And some of the survivors said, I hope I would have been killed in 1982 rather than lived through all of this again. Then when you compare that to for example, Croatian POWs during the Croatian War, or for example, right now, when you look at some of these prisoner of war camps throughout the world, you don't have a lot of torture or humiliation mechanisms or experiences in that large sense whatsoever. So, but here what we can see is there's a large pattern of it throughout the whole concept, and it's actually when I realized that when I started putting down the charts, and first I had the demographic charts, which I saw that were very low. For example, in the largest death rate in a camp was, I think, 485 or 65, depending on these issues. And again, there's no paper trail taken down by the camp authorities, so it's very difficult to establish. But then again, when you compare this to the number of people who went through the camp, like for example, you have 40,000 people going through Ternopolje, where the number of people killed in Ternopolje was low. But if you have a 11-year-old girl raped in Ternopil, that's a different issue. So we always have to put these things in context, and that's when I came up with this theory of collective traumatization, where you have these cases of several public executions or murders or acts of violence going on publicly in front of a lot of people without any shame, without any attempt to hide it. Why do this unless you really want everybody to see it? Like there was a case in Visegrad, and I mentioned this in my book, where an elderly man was taken out from the sports hall where people were held in the Hasan Velikovic school, and this was done in front of 300-400 civilians, women and children. And after a few moments, the soldiers came back inside and threw the man's severed head among the people. So this act itself statistically means one person was dead that night, was killed. But in fact, when you speak to people who were that night in that camp, they all remember this event very vividly. So that's when I realized actually that having this pattern throughout the country at this time where there was no internet connection, no Viber to send out information and so on, this showed that the way how the Bosnian Serb authorities locally wanted to kick out and to forever erase this community was by the way of collective traumatization, where statistically you would kill a small number of people, but in fact inflict such large psychological pain that these people would never want to return back to their former homes, which was fascinating because this took part in several months, basically. This was from April, May, June, July, August, and that's it. So these events did not last longer than August or September in most of these towns. But how is it possible that in such a small amount of months you inflict such a large effect of pain, psychological pain on the people that they never want, that they are totally uprooted from their communities, an area where people lived for decades, suddenly go and live in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Australia, in the US, and never want to return back. Some of them have totally stopped talking in Bosnian, totally forgetting their past lives. So for me, this was very important to go into the details and to identify what were the main factors for this. And for me, in my opinion, it was this torture and this humiliation by the perpetrators. And a very important aspect is that in most cases, in these small local communities, these perpetrators knew their victims. So they were basically neighbors. And this effect is much more larger when you know the perpetrator. If it was somebody who just came out from another city, from another country, and so on, this wouldn't be the case. But the fact that your high school teacher or your elementary school pupil or somebody came and knocked on your door one day with a Kalashnikov, that changed the facts very, very, very much on the ground. So this idea of collective traumatization is basically a series of incidents, let's say, or events such as public executions, ceremonial executions. For different dates, holidays, and so on, rape and sexual abuse of females, but also of males, mass execution of elites, the destruction of cultural and religious heritage, and things like that, which all together sum up in this collective traumatization that they are entirely feeling unwelcome to ever return back to their former homes, and also that they never want to, that they once and for all and their previous lives.
No, thank you, Hikmet. No, I think it's fascinating that you discovered this pattern for the motivation of the perpetrators, or for the detention camps, let's say, as institutions. And to move on to then, so you focused on then 4 different municipalities. And you found that there were variations also not in the patterns of violence that took place, including how the camps operated in each of the 4 regions that you looked at. So Just tell us about what you learned from, what lessons did you learn about looking across these multiple sites instead of just focusing on one, say?
So basically, how I picked up on these sites were by identifying 4 locations, which geographically and politically represent different locations within the Bosnian Serb entity. How I came to this is by picking out a town from each of these so-called autonomous regions. This is a bit complicated right now, so I have to go back to 1991 when these small. So this was right after the first general elections in 1990. The Bosnian Serb leadership of the Serb Democratic Party, the Serb nationalist, extremist nationalist group party, they established so-called Serbian autonomous regions, which were supposed to be some sort of, let's say, cultural, educational regions which would gather local Serbs around. But in fact, these were parallel political institutions, which very quickly in 1991 and 1982 became part of what is right now called Republika Srpska, or the Serb Republic. So these were areas where very quickly they had their own parallel police, constitution, police force, assembly, normative acts, and things like that. So I picked up a town from each of these 4 major autonomous regions, because my claim is that the violence which was committed was on a micro level. So the idea came from a macro level, implemented through the meso level, but which went through the meso level, but implemented by the micro level. Which meaning the local perpetrators, the local government, the local municipality, the local police force. So, in my opinion, Radovan Karčić, as the head commander-in-chief of the Bosnian Serb army and so on, he did not necessarily know or need to know what was going on in Prijedor or in Visegrad or in Gacko, Bjelić and so on. But he stood behind the idea of it, and even when he did know, he did not interfere in it. But the implementation of this whole entire project was committed by the micro level and coordinated by the meso level. And so basically these Serbian autonomous regions became a meso level sort of regional governments which were operating. So these 4 towns which I took, which was Prijedor, Bijeljina, Visegrad, and Bjelića, are geographically very, very far from each other. They have a very different demographic status. Again, demography has a lot to do with the genocide. So in areas where you had a very clear picture in which like the majority were Serbs, so like in Bjelića, the amount of people killed there was insignificant. Even the amount of torture which was committed there was brutal, but in most of the cases, when you have 10-20% of non-Serbs living in Bjelića, they didn't really care because this was a small, insignificant amount of people living there. So they're not a political or a military threat. Whereas in Prijedor, where you had, a large number of people living, and where you had almost 50% equal amount of Serbs and Bosniaks living, that's where the violence was much more bigger, because the effect or the sense that the other side, the other group, might overpower them was much larger. That's why the torture and the humiliation and the other extreme acts were much more brutal in these areas where the population was some sort of where there was no exact majority, to say. The same thing is with Bijeljina. And then you have cases where you had extreme violence, such as Visegrad, where a majority of the population, more than 60%, were Bosniak Muslims. So you had the minority with the help of the Serbian army taking control of the municipality, and then by 1st August, there was not a single non-Serb living in Visegrad. So basically within 2.5 months, the whole entire population of the Bosniaks was kicked out. And when you compare these statistically, these demographics At the time, you can see this drastic demographic changes. For example, in Visegrad, in 1987, you had a total of 3 Bosniaks living from a population of 12,000 before the war of Bosniaks. So you can see how in a matter of a few months, a large number of people are entirely uprooted from their local communities. Thus, I wanted to show that these camp systems and the strategy behind this so-called cleansing process was not an incident. It was not something which occurred individually. It was a well thought out plan implemented throughout the whole entire country. And so thus when you compare this throughout the whole country from Prijedor to Bileća, which is hundreds of kilometers away from each other, then you can see how there was one specific plan to get rid of the unwanted group. And this was all set up through the official documentation of the Serb Democratic Party and of the Bosnian Serb leadership. And I mentioned that in my book, the 6 strategic goals of the Serbian people, which was brought out in May 1982. And of course, the very important, often bypassed document, which is on the instructions for the local municipalities, the variant A and variant B. A in the sense where the majority are Serbs, and B in the sense where the Serbs are a minority, how to act in these municipalities in the case of a war. So when you read these official document, that's when you can see how this was an official policy of the new nation state.
Yeah, the December 1991 instructions, right before the war actually started. It's fast. So with these, which I read in your book, the variations and the patterns of violence that went through each municipality in the camps. Well, you also make a distinction between detention facilities and concentration camps, and you also identified the differences in the structure between the camps and the sites as well, the facilities. And some were very organized, and others very disorganized, some more violent. This is where the patterns of violence come in, and some were less so, and that this related to authority. And then also you see some that only existed for a really short period of time, and some that existed for longer periods of time. So what can you tell us about this?
Well,
in terms of structure.
Well, firstly, even though the idea behind the camp system was very well thought and so on, the implementation itself was very chaotic and very, let's say, not so innovative. To say it was very primitive. There was a lot of improvisation in it. So, for example, like unlike the Holocaust or other case, or the Uyghurs right now in China, there was no specific camp which was built for detention or for the concentration camps. Rather, existing facilities such as hotels, schools, in most cases schools, were used for the detention. Why schools? Because in most of these villages, cities, and so on, schools were the ones which had a fenced area, which had a large sports hall, which was perfect for incarceration of civilians. And there was no school at the time in 1982. In May 1982, the school year had already finished, so the schools were empty. And in most of these cases, like in Visegrad, in Bratunac, in Prijedor, and so on, the schools were used for the detention. Unlike the case of Batković, for example, where I mentioned, which was sort of agricultural facility, a military facility, agricultural. That's where this camp exists for the whole entire period of the war and the genocide. Whereas these improvised locations, such as Visegrad, Prijedor, and so on, these 4 camps, which were specifically set up to be used for a short period of time. When you conduct the cleansing operation in a village, you keep the civilians in a camp for a few days, a few weeks, and then you deport them from there. So there was this whole entire process which was going on. Unlike Omarska and Batković and so on, where the people were held in Majača, where people were held there for longer periods of time. And what is more important is that I mentioned this in the book, the fact that foreign journalists uncovered Omarska and Ternopolje in August 5th, 1982, helped save the lives of these people. So if the journalists had not entered the camps, and this is Edward Yami, Penny Marshall from ITN and The Guardian, if they did not enter the camps in August 1992, the death rate in these camps would have been much larger by the end of the year. So I'm very sure of it, because the health status of most of the camp detainees was so bad that they were basically the living dead in these cases, and most of them later on even died from the conditions inside the camps. So this is Omarska, Ternopolje, and the other camps. Whereas you had Batković, for example, which was in Majača, where the conditions were much better. Much better in the sense that they were not as worse as Omarska, and which lasted for actually the whole entire wartime. So Majača, for example, was firstly used for Croatian POWs during the Croatian War, and then for Bosniak civilians. Batković was used the whole entire war as sort of a detention facility, but also a concentration camp and a transit camp for different POWs. So you had a combination of civilians and soldiers inside, Croatians and Bosniaks as well, Batković. This lasted the whole entire war. So the last people who were in Batković, for example, in 1985, and who were exchanged in 1996, were around 100 people from Srebrenica who were very badly injured and taken from a hospital, I think, in Srebrenica, and brought there. They were in such a bad shape that nobody really wanted to kill them, because they thought that they were going to die. But they were the last people who were exchanged from Batković in February 1996. So you have this case with Batković existing for the whole entire wartime, whereas you had these other local small areas such as schools and Visegrad and so on, which lasted from May, June, July, and then in August the schools were cleaned up. Then in September the schools were reopened for children again. So this was one of the most fascinating things for me to uncover, like the school Hasan Velitovac school, where the severed head was thrown inside in June 1982, was reopened for children in September 1982. So this shows actually that the intent behind all of these were different, and also maybe the most important aspect of the camps is it depended on who was running the camps. So even though it's very difficult to establish a clear command chain in most of the camps, according to the ICTY and the Bosnian court judgments and so on, and the things which I uncovered is that in most cases the perpetrators, the guards, were members of the police force, and mostly the members of the reserve police force. And the police camps were much more worse than the army camps. So Majača and Batković, for example, were army controlled. Omarska, Hasan Velitovac, and so on, they were police controlled, and they were much more worse than the military control. Why is this the case? We don't know for sure. You can come up with some explanations that the army was much more well organized from the previous system. The police was known for its brutality even during the Yugoslav period, so that's possibly something which can be done. Secondly, these reserve police force members were people who got very quick training in a matter of a few months, and they were there to do the dirty job, basically. So they were tolerated by the local governments in order to get the things done. And later on, these were ordinary men, people who were postmen, who were bank accountants, and so on, who later on continued working their jobs. Then they were not members of the police force anymore. So that's why we can come up with these different theories on. But basically, it's very difficult to come up with one clear picture of all of the camps. For each camp, you can come up with a new specific just like in the Holocaust or in other camp systems, each camp is similar, but it's also very different. So even in Bosnia, we had a very primitive approach to the operation of the camp. There was a lot of improvisation, especially in the first couple of months. It was very, especially with no paper trail, it's very difficult to establish some of the facts.
Well, I think, well, you sort of answered my next question there, but I think that your book and this work that you've done is now we know a lot more than we did before. So so this is what we need more of. But I'll get to the part that really interested me only because it relates to my PhD, and that's the Krizní štábová, the crisis committees, these meso-level parallel governmental structures that played a really central role in the cleansing process and the establishment of the camps. So did you find that their participation, coordination, and collaboration with the camp commanders vary from municipality to municipality, and how involved were they basically?
The crisis staff was the key institution for the implementation of the project, of the criminal project. They were in fact the local municipal governments. So once the war started, the local municipal governments were dissolved. They were put on hold. These crisis staff were put in, and they were the ones who coordinated with the police and with the army to implement the criminal project. So they were basically the ones who decided on the kill list, on the areas where to set up the camps, on basically virtually everything, on who was going to live, who was going to die, and you can see this through the Miroslav Deronic judgment for Bratunac. Even though that's, I think there are even more things that he could have said and that could have been put in the judgment, but the things which we know and especially from some other towns as well, it's shown that these crisis staff institutions were very crucial in the establishment, and not only in the establishment of the camp, but also in the whole conduct of. And of course, the implementation differed from area to area because it all depended on the staff that you have, on the cadre that you have. Some were much more efficient than the others. Some were simple apparatchiks who wanted to get the job done and to show off to their bosses. But what was interesting is that in some cases, I mean, in most cases, these guys did not put up any resistance to the plan itself. What you had was cases where these men, these legal formalists from the communist era, where they knew very well how to evade responsibility for what was going to happen. I think that's something which they learned in communism, where it was always you always had to be very careful in what you signed, what decision you brought, and that's why we have a very small amount of paper trails for most of the crisis stuff. Whereas in the case of Prijedor, you have these guys who were totally crazy. I mean, they were signing off a lot of stuff for the establishment of a camp, for deportation, for you have these lists of you have a contract between the camp, the crisis staff and the bus company for deportations. I mean, this was very rare in some of these cases. Like in Zvornik, you have a very, I mean, their crisis staff is also very how do you call it? They liked having everything on paper, so they had this lists of like deportations, but also bringing in refugees to live in Muslim villages, for example. Like in one box you have deportacja, and then the other one is naseljavanje, bringing people over. So, and this is all written like, which bus company, who was the bus driver, and the bus company saying, you owe us money for the last trip and things like that. So they're very, very interesting sort of thing. But then in Visegrad, you don't have any of this because the crisis staff there was very smart. They didn't leave, and so the personality and the educational level and the cadre of these people working in the crisis staff had a lot to do with how the project was implemented on the local level.
That was going to be my next question, but you just answered it. So thank you for that. Yeah, no, and what I've found in my own research is also that it seems that personalities have a very big factor in how the crisis staffs or committees operate in different municipalities, but also their motivations as well, their individual motivations. Some of them differ from what I found to what's happening at the top as well. And that sort of plays into how things are operating on the ground level. But yeah, then also there's a lot of documentation that's just non-existent. So it's not a very easily researched phenomena. But yeah, no, thank you for that. So moving on, because I'm seeing that we're moving to the end here. So what are the challenges nowadays of doing this sort of work in Bosnia? And how has the response been to the book in the region so far?
Oh, well, the responses to the book in the region have been quite positive, actually, much more positive than I was expecting. So that's really great to hear. I'm getting more attention outside of the country, like in the US and so on, than in the country, which is okay, normal as well. Because to some extent, people in Bosnia and in the Balkans have become fed up with this topic, which is sort of say quite normal or understandable. 30 years has passed, and this topic has been very much politicized and manipulated by political figures and so on. So people are not that interested in it. But for me, what was important was to write the book in English, to have it for a Western audience, and also to counter the attempts to deny the camps which existed in Prijedor. This was something which was done by a very famous case in Great Britain, where a leftist magazine called Living Marxism was denying the fact that Trnopolje and Omarska existed, and they were sued by ITN, and this was a court case sometime in the 1990s, which the ITN got. But we still see some of these denialist efforts going on again from time to time among different media outlets. So having this for a Western media audience, for an international audience, was my aim, my goal. It's always very difficult to write about what people survived in an area, in a community where many of the people. So, and you can't really always tell everybody's story, because for each camp, for each person, it's the story itself. So, but nevertheless, I think the whole concept of the theory is something which was accepted by many, and that's something which I was really I was afraid that many people won't accept it. But the result, the feedback I got was very positive on everything, and I think that as a society we have finally come to that time to focus more on mental health issues than we have 20 years ago, 15 years, 10 years ago, and so on. Because the recent war in Ukraine stirred up a lot of unease in the country. And I think for the first time in a long time, Bosnians managed to identify themselves with Ukrainians. Because we didn't see this in the case of the Syrian war or anywhere else. But for the first time, I saw a genuine fear in among my fellow countrymen when the war in Ukraine started. When Kiev was being bombarded and so on. That's when they felt really, really afraid, and that's when you could see this PTSD, coming back again, and so on and so forth. And so that's why I think that this idea of the collective traumatization is something which they really picked up on, which a lot of people recognize as something which because they, in most cases you couldn't really argue with the facts. The number of people exhumed from mass graves, the number of people killed in the camps. It was a bit difficult to argue what the aim of the camps was in the end, because the people weren't killed, they were tortured, they were humiliated. So what was the aim behind it? And so, well, to go back to the first part of your question, what are the challenges? I think the challenges in Bosnia are very similar to the challenges of most academics who are dealing with this topic worldwide. That is, firstly, the lack of funds for this kind of research. Secondly, the very tiring entire process of getting things accurate. The fact that this is a very emotionally draining process. I really envy some of my colleagues who go back very far in history and write about the Roman Empire, and they could make a mistake about what happened some 600-700 years ago in Bosnia. But if I make a mistake on the name of a village, then I'll be crucified by some of my friends. So that's one of the challenges you always have here as writing about the very near past, and that's something which is always very, very, very tiring. But nevertheless, it's something which I think is very important to do, and for everybody's sake, and for the fact that we as a society can finally heal and move forward by having all these facts out there.
No, I completely agree. And you touch upon this in your conclusion as well, when you speak about post-war reality and camp memory as well. But we're nearing the end. So last question, what is the one thing that you hope that the audience takes away as a result of today, apart from go and buy my book, obviously?
Well, the first thing is that we definitely need to pay more attention to the whole idea of camps, like especially with the Uyghurs going on in China, with some of the stories which I'm reading about Ukrainian camps for Ukrainians in Russia, which we still don't have any information about. It's still very, very blurred and so on. So definitely, I think all those who are thinking about a new idea, this will be something which will really be important to research more in detail. While I was writing my book, 2 books came out on camps. One was, and I had just finished my first introductory part on history, and then you had Dan Stone coming out with his book on concentration camp, and Andrea Pirster on the history of camps. This is a very important topic where unfortunately we don't have a lot of literature and scholarship on it. So with China going on, with the Uyghurs, with everything else, I think it's very important to have more and more of this scholarship out there.
Thank you so much, Hikmet. And I'll hand it back to you, Melanie.
Thank you so much, both. That was fantastic and really fascinating. I'm going to be really cheeky and use my chair's prerogative. I love to ask this question. Hikmet, could you tell us about the picture on the cover? Because it's quite striking. It's quite empty, and then you have this one chair there. So could you tell us about the picture?
So that picture was taken by my friend Pavel, who is a Polish photographer. I met him a few years ago. He was going through Bosnia, taking photographs of former detention camps in Bosnia, and that photograph from the cover picture is from Omarska, from the White House in Omarska, which was a torture area, and that chair was used for interrogation. So that picture has a lot of for me it's very important, because many people who were inside this small facility actually never came out alive. So that chair which he encountered, and when he entered inside the room, it's not there anymore, but a couple of years ago you could come in and see the chair. It was probably one of the last places where the detainees were held before they were killed.
So not only visually striking, but incredibly meaningful and important as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think, to me, that your book is not just important in what it records about what took place during the conflict and genocide in Bosnia, but it also really echoes patterns and perpetrator intents and actions from genocide more broadly. And so it contributes in a really important way to this broader discussion about genocide and how it takes place and how we understand it. So I think it's a really important contribution not just to the literature on Bosnia, but on genocide studies more broadly. So thank you so much. And I'd like to thank the audience for joining us tonight. And our next month's webinar will be running on the 14th of December. And Jonathan Leder Maynard will be talking with discussant Christian Gudehus about his book, which is called Ideology and Mass Killing: The Radicalized Security Politics of Genocides and Deadly Atrocities. So we hope to see you all there at the next one. And thank you again to Mirjana and Hikmet for such a fantastic discussion tonight.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you, Hikmet.
Thank you. Thank you so much.